My name is Deirdre Kamlani, and I'm the Civics Chair of the Greenwich League. We're delighted for you all to meet our guest speaker, Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer, who has joined us for our first program of 2022. Sandy Waters and I had the chance to see Dr. Lukensmeyer speak at the Connecticut State League Convention last summer, and we were so taken by her presentation that we were determined to find a way to bring her to Greenwich. So we're really excited she could be with us tonight. Before we start, I just want to quickly go over some event logistics. This is a webinar, so you can see us, but we can't see you. Dr. Lukensmeyer will speak for about 30 minutes and we'll take questions for the remaining 30 minutes. If you have a question for her, please type those into the Q&A. You will notice that the chat function is not available. My program committee colleague and partner on this program, Christina Broderick, will be moderating the question and answer session. In some ways, this event represents a natural progression from our last two, which focused on constructive debate across party lines and community building. Tonight, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Lukensmeyer about the science, the cultural and behavioral factors that impede our ability to communicate across the partisan divide, and the structural and institutional factors that are weakening our democracy. The good news is that we'll also learn how we can do our part to begin to reverse these worrying trends, build trust and community, and start to put our democracy back on more solid ground. With that, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer. She was the first executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that works to reduce dysfunction and incivility in our political system, and whose founding chairmen were George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Dr. Lukensmeyer is a leader in the field of deliberative democracy. Prior to taking on her role at NICD, she was the founder and president of America Speaks, an award-winning nonprofit that seeks to reinvigorate American democracy by engaging citizens in the public decision-making process. During her tenure, America Speaks engaged more than 200,000 people and hosted events across all 50 states and throughout the world. She also served as a consultant to the White House Chief of Staff in the early 1990s and was the Chief of Staff to Ohio Governor Richard Celeste, becoming the first woman to ever serve in that capacity. She earned her PhD in organizational behavior from Case Western Reserve University and has completed postgraduate training at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer.
I believe the host has to allow me to be seen by video. Deirdre, thank you for that lovely introduction, and I am truly delighted to be with you this evening. And I most want to immediately express my gratitude for how many people have actually joined this evening. As we all understand, the existential threats to our democratic institutions and frankly to our democratic way of life is as serious as has been true since pre-Civil War Reconstruction. It's just amazing where we are. Highly concerning, and for us to move out of this space to reestablish civility, respect, and to ensure that our institutions do evolve to meet the challenges, it will take each of us and all of us. So thank you very much for being willing to be with us tonight. For me, there are two themes to what I want to talk with you about tonight. Any democratic society has to be built on the foundation of trust and has to be built on facts and truth. And we are now at a time in the United States when both of these are broken. The trust has broken at a more severe level than has ever been tracked before. Gallup began to follow this data post-World War II. And 2 years ago, we hit the nadir in terms of trust in our democratic institutions. The Congress had hit 9% of Americans that actually still expressed that they thought Congress was doing its work. In some ways, equally and maybe even more disturbing is 2 years ago, we hit the point where less than 50% of us actually trust our fellow Americans. It's as simple whether we trust them to do what they say they will do, or whether we trust them to act in the best interests of the common good. So all of our talk tonight will be focused on what are things that have to be done to rebuild trust and to come back to a place where we have a shared set of facts on which to operate at the community level and national level. I'll spend just a few minutes. We all know this, but I know you might appreciate some very recent data about the increase in polarization and how it's reflected. And you will receive copies of this PowerPoint, so don't worry about taking notes. 87% of us now say that it's a threat to America. 71 of us are convinced, 71%, that American democracy itself is now threatened. 66% see the opposing party as a serious threat to the United States. And we're already above 50% that believe that other people in America pose the biggest threat to our country. Directly in line with that, our national and domestic security agencies now think of domestic violence and domestic terrorism as a higher threat to us than international terrorism. Let's go back for a moment to the issue of, in this time when people are otherizing each other and in fact demonizing the other, here's some facts about that. 77% of us have few or no friends from the other side. 41% say no friends from the other side. 60% of us now live in landslide counties where the Democrat or Republican presidential candidate wins by 20+ points. Bill Bishop wrote a great book a decade and a half ago called The Big Sort, in which he described how we were systematically moving geographically to be living with people who share the same worldview that we share. Gerrymandering has matched that up with congressional districts to ensure the data that I just shared. 85% say those who voted for the other presidential candidate do not understand people like them. And frankly, the language is often stronger than do not understand. Very often it's do not respect. 62% say the political climate prevents them from saying what they believe. We all know this in our daily lives. We've just gone through a holiday in which, once again, many families have experienced the crisis of division over vaccination, in which the family holiday could not be celebrated in the traditional ways because of the bright line drawn about what it means if I chose to be vaccinated, what it means if I chose not to be vaccinated. I want to talk for a minute about the truth issue. The misinformation environment that we are now in the midst of represents a dramatic shift in the media ecology. The internet, which we all first were enthused about its democratization and the ability for all of us to present our views, quickly shifted to the negative unintended consequences of the internet in terms of social media as being a broadcast system in which we basically all shout out our views. And that had led to a business model that profits from misinformation and division. And that same business model has undermined traditional media, particularly print. People now make choices about what they watch, what they listen to, and are choosing only sources that reaffirm their beliefs, or even of more concern, choosing sources that are fundamentally completely conspiracies that have no basis in fact whatsoever. How do we combat that? We won't have a lot of time for that this evening, but one of the pins I'd like to put in the map is think in your own community, do you have trusted local media sources, radio, television streaming, print, social media? And if not, can the League or individual members in Greenwich choose to be a force for creating a trusted local media source. So just back to how bad the misinformation is. And I'm not going to do all the numbers, but people still believe Trump cut Social Security. Obviously, the worst one is the 23 million Americans who still believe that the election was rigged and that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president. I'm not even going to go through the rest of these. You can look at them, you hear them every day. It is tragic what ideas have now been lodged and are held tightly in people's minds that are completely based on nothing. I want to take a minute to make an important point about human beings being social beings. People respond to the context they're in, the structure that they're in, and the signals they're receiving in that structure. When I was leading America Speaks in 2010, we ran a national discussion on debt and deficit. You may remember that was the year that the Tea Party really actually took off in this country. And in the project that we did, 3,500 Americans, representative demographically of the country and the jurisdiction in which they were meeting, actually cut $26 trillion from the deficit by 2025. Even though in the morning in a pretest, all people who labeled themselves as conservative or right of center said they would not raise fees, taxes, anything to help solve the problem. And everybody who self-identified as left of center would not cut entitlements under any circumstances. Well, it takes a bright fourth grader about 15 or 20 minutes to figure out you can't solve the country's deficit without doing both. And to these Americans' credit, when sitting at a table with people who thought differently than they did, but being presented with factual information and the ability to call experts who shared their ideological bias to the table to discuss, they actually came to the understanding you had to do both, and they chose to do both. 6 months later, in that election year, after people had watched hundreds of millions of dollars of typical campaign advertising, these same people, if we'd been able to track them as individuals, went back to their camps and voted no new taxes, no cutting entitlements. So the same human being in one context chose to make a very difficult decision in the interest of the common good, and in a different context went back to identity politics and chose a negative outcome for the country. In order to rebuild trust in the country and where we are in our democracy, please change the slide. There are two levels that the work has to be done on: behavioral and cultural, and structural. The media more often talks about the structural issues: too much money in politics, gerrymandering, a fact that minority votes can overrule majority decisions in our Congress. All of these things are important. We're going to spend most, and the League frankly works on many of those topics, those structural issues. I'm going to spend most of our time talking about the behavioral and cultural issues, because over the last 3 decades, even beginning a little earlier than that, this divisiveness began to seep into our community life, into our families, into the places of worship, into places that we work. So let's say we could wave a wand and we actually got money out of politics. We actually went to citizen commissions to determine districts. We actually instituted ranked choice voting in every state in the country. We would still have serious work to do to shift the minds of millions of Americans who've been stuck in a place of accepting misinformation as if it is reality. And this is something we encounter in our daily lives. And this is something that each one of us as American citizens, as residents in our communities, can learn to be effective change makers on a one-on-one or small group basis. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about for the rest of the evening. I said this when we started. I've been working in the issues of the health of democracy in the United States for 30 years. And I'm tragically sad to say it's at the worst nadir that's ever been true in modern political history. So this is a moment when every single one of us must stand up for democracy and do all that we can do to shift the weight back into the direction of the kinds of values and behaviors that a democratic society is founded on. I'm going to talk a lot about the capacity to listen. When people take self-report little assessments, there are two areas that psychologists and ethicists have found that we always overrate ourselves. Now, I've kind of given you the answer here, but there are two issues. Almost all of us rate ourselves as better listeners than we actually are. And all of us rate ourselves as making more ethical decisions in every arena of our life than we actually do. But let's focus in on listening. On the screen, you see something that Cheryl helped lead at NICD, a little video that demonstrates what's necessary to engage people to actually be able to hear one another across their differences. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 principles about that. First of all, you have to start with curiosity, not animosity. And this one is very tough as I've watched this around the vaccine question. Most people are now very dug in. People who've been vaccinated really feel as if those who've chosen not to be are endangering other people's health. That may even be factual. But the bottom line is, if I'm making a judgment about you and your choice not to be vaccinated, the chances of me listening to you long enough to truly understand why you've made the choice and to connect with you that might help you to make a different decision, it just isn't going to happen unless we choose to listen from a perspective. My goal is not to change your behavior. My goal is to understand what in your life experience brought you to make the decision that you've made. And the agreement when you start is each person's going to have a chance to talk and each person's going to have a chance to listen. Undoubtedly, and it could be a different topic. Are you for getting rid of the filibuster or against getting rid of the filibuster in order to pass the voting rights protection bills that are in front of our Congress? The point is to begin the conversation. I'm the listener, you're presenting your position. You are undoubtedly going to say something that will trigger me, something that I want to put out a fact that you've said something I know isn't true. Got to not do that. Got to take a deep breath. And the way out of being triggered is, number one, take a breath and then ask a question. What source of information did you use for that? What brought you to believe that? Are other people in your social circle sharing that same view? Again, just having a pattern of questions that the person now believes you want to hear. Remember in that earlier slide, most people don't believe that the other side wants to hear them. So when we're starting out on a one-on-one in this tough conversation, we have to establish the groundwork. I am truly going to listen to you. And vice versa, when it's your turn to listen to me. And the goal is to come to some place of understanding and hopefully even empathy for how this person came to make their decision. There are lots of resources now. Literally thousands of organizations have sprung up since the 2016 election. And for the 30 years prior to that, a large number were already operating. We've highlighted a few that we know do excellent trainings. The National Institute for Civil Discourse, which I led for 7 years and which Cheryl is still the national organizer for. Essential Partners in Cambridge, Massachusetts does fabulous training. What they managed to do, and Greenwich might think about this if you don't have locally sourced training for this kind of work. Essential Partners works with you in a way that the community ends up owning the capacity to sustain the training in different groups, faith groups, business groups, schools, and new immigrants, new refugee communities. Braver Angels, Living Room Conversations. We were talking before the webinar started that Princeton has a project called Bridging Divides, and they actually have a map up on their website, which I think we've already put probably in the chat room as a resource, that literally shows little blue dots on a map of every community in the United States that has some of this kind of work going on. I've been doing this for a long time, and I want to tell you, when I see that map, it makes me more hopeful, because what it tells us, and what we know from poll data, fully 75% of Americans know that where we are on this divide, polarization, demonizing one another is wrong, and they want to do something about it. So if you as an individual, or if the Greenwich League as a chapter initiates this kind of work in the community, training the trainers, offering as many opportunities for groups of difference to come together as possible, you will not have trouble finding people who want to join you. Now, I often get asked, well, what about these people that are conspiracy theorists and really do believe there was a child porn ring that was holding children hostage in a pizza parlor in DC? I mean, that's how absurd some of this is. Well, that represents at most, and it's tragic, but it could be as much as 10 or 12% of the population. And then we have a version of that on the left that isn't as dominant in this cycle. But the bottom line is, don't start with people of that level of extremity. 75% of us want to do this. We're scared. We don't know how. We don't feel like we have the skills. So that's the place that individual people who want to take a stand on this, or an organization like yours, can come together and create the place in the community, several different places based on who the population is, that it's safe to do this. And now mostly we're doing it in Zoom anyway. But so here's a few resources. You'll find many more on our website. The League has been known from the very beginning to be very active on the most basic structural issues, ensuring that every person has the right to vote, and ensuring that every person knows where and when and how to vote. What I think could be important for you as League members this particular year, because 2022 is going to be a watershed year. We are either going to individually and collectively take enough actions to protect our democracy that we begin a trajectory of rising out of where we are in terms of the dominance of misinformation, the big lie, or whether or not, by how votes go in 2022, we lose another foundation corner in our institutional democracy. And if we do, that will be a moment as sober as the declaring of the Civil War. So you're already going to do this, but how do you make this work both more visible and so important that more and more people want to be engaged in helping you do it? Making sure people register, getting out the vote, being a source of factual information on a local level if you still do not have the local trusted media sources that I spoke about earlier. You know, I think we've all gone through a civics education process in the last year in terms of how the election process actually works, and the hundreds of thousands of volunteers across the country that ensure a nonpartisan, trustworthy election process. This is a time to pay real attention to who's doing that work in your community, and to make sure that the people who are doing that work are in the line of neutral and trustworthy. You are trusted community voices. And in those roles, you individually, and again, I want to emphasize collectively, can help rebuild trust in your community. My guess, I actually have never even visited Greenwich, Connecticut. I certainly should do that sometime. But Greenwich may be a community that is not quite as divided in the toxic ways that we're seeing in many communities. So you need to do a community assessment. Who are the most marginalized people in our community who may be experiencing the barriers to engaging in the structural issues that matter in terms of voting and matter in terms of knowing that one of the gifts of being a citizen, a resident on the way to being citizen is in fact that your voice is just as important as every other voice in the community. I want to close. Cheryl found this quote and shared it with me a couple of years ago. And it just warmed my heart because it's the message for 2022. The success of democracy does not depend on a few persons who do great things. Thank goodness they exist. John Lewis comes to mind in the importance of the John Lewis Act to protect voting rights. But democracy depends on many, many, many people who do small things faithfully. Thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful, and I very much look forward to engaging with you with some Q&A and hopefully getting a dialogue going. I think Christina is going to join me in terms of managing the Q&A.
She had trouble getting on, so.
Well, if that Zoom is a wonderful environment, but sometimes it trips us up. There she is.
Hi, sorry. Sorry
Welcome,
about
welcome
that.
back, Christina. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for that. You've definitely opened up a very large topic here that I know that we're going to have lots of discussion on. So I will go ahead and kick off with some of the questions that have come in.
Great.
Okay, our first one, when you were talking about people being social beings, this person is asking, what happens to us as social beings when we experience prolonged isolation, as with what's happened with the pandemic?
That is a great question. There's a whole range, and our introversion extroversion is connected to your question. More extroverted people actually are more dependent upon interaction with other people to not feel lonely and isolated. So there have been some very interesting studies in terms of who has been most impacted by the psychological sense of isolation. And the people who, this will not surprise anybody in this call, the people who have been most impacted about this is actually young people, teenagers particularly, who are still in the identity formation time of their lives and who are dependent upon social interactions for confirmation of their well-being and importance. So that is, obviously it's happened to many adults as well, but if you want to look across the country, who has had the most struggles with isolation and loneliness, it has been identified as particularly teenagers who are dependent on that kind of feedback and who do not thrive in online learning environments. So put those two things together, they have really been challenged in the past 2 years. Let me say one more thing if I can, because we're back in the mess again. I think if this is an issue in your life, or you know someone, an adult who it is an issue, work with them to create a bubble of a very small group of people who've had both vaccinations, who've been boosted, who've been serious or stayed serious about masking and social distancing, but who can go for a walk in an afternoon with one another. So identify some link outside the home that is safe, but allows people to stay connected to at least one or two other people that are important to them.
This one's an interesting question about surveys. And this person is saying that since they've been home, they've realized how many surveys come through on the phone that they choose not to pick up or answer. And that's led them to wonder, why should we trust today's surveys when only a select group might be participating in the surveys?
Well, I really appreciate that question, because I started America Speaks. This may surprise whoever asked the question, but I'm going to give some context here. I started America Speaks because I was very concerned that the only kind of data about we the people that ever got into the policy process was poll data, survey data. Survey data is an aggregate of individual opinion at a given moment in time. And it's very unstable data. It changes based on the most recent mass shooting or the most recent negative behavior in Congress. So surveys, what you want to do in terms of trusting survey data is identify a small number of sources that you know enough about to know that, number one, they are using random samples. They are using telephone follow-up for those subpopulations that don't respond to polls right away. The one I have the most faith in is Pew. Their research projects always they always ensure that the way you phrased your question couldn't happen, that the surveys are not just being asked from a certain category of people, but are actually getting the slice of American life. I hope that was helpful.
Yes. This one is a question about commenting on the matter of respect for each other as well. Are your steps applicable here to respect as they would think they are? It's so hard to respect persons whose opinions have no basis in fact.
This is the toughest part of where we are, I think, for most people, including myself. I mean, I've been professionally and personally disciplined to do this work for decades. And yet I, in the last few years, have found myself challenged to I can't get my mind around how someone could actually believe whatever the end of that sentence is. So what the advice I take is to myself is the same advice I give constantly when I'm doing this professionally in training. In that instance, you have to somehow create the circumstances in which you back up and a human connection gets created about the two of you, between the two of you. That could be by a values question. That could be by discovering one of the videos that I saw on TV the other night talked about two people who had totally different political views, did not respect each other, but they both discovered that they had experienced serious losses of death in quick succession. And once that happened, once they understood that about each other, there was a total different kind of openness to learning and understanding why they felt the way they felt about some of these topics. And then, frankly, I want to acknowledge what I said in my talk, is that there are some people that are so extreme at this point in time that you would quickly understand that there isn't a way to build that bridge. And it's not something that you should put energy into.
We had a question about characterizing all opposing viewpoints as misinformation. There were a lot of viewpoints in your slides, and I don't know if you could comment on that.
That's an astute point. I think when people have gotten very closely identified with their partisan label, that's when they begin to think, well, if you're a Democrat or if you're a Republican, then all of your views are based on misinformation. It's just a matter of tracking back far enough to discover what the misinformation is. To that, I would say it's the same as any other generalization in our lives. It's just not possible that every single view that I hold is based on information. So again, am I someone you want to establish a relationship with? Am I someone who you care enough about that you want to try to help me out of the misinformation that I have now grown to believe, that you will be patient and take the steps necessary to work this through? A resource that I would recommend, Peter Coleman, who is a professor of conflict and resolution and mediation at Columbia University, has just published a new book called The Way Out. And he really takes on this issue of where someone's gotten very far into the conspiracy theory world, so that layer after layer after layer of what they come up with to substantiate what they believe is in fact based on information. And how do you slowly establish the connection and rebuild trust that eventually, in that case, you are also teaching them how they have been manipulated to actually come to believe that. But this takes time, and this takes patience, and you have to be completely absent of judgment, because a person who is sucked into a conspiracy world expects to be disrespected, expects you not to be willing to stay with them.
What has withered the idea of common good that used to drive so much legislation?
Oh boy, take a deep breath here. One of the things that I think is important for all of us to understand, and more people have written about this both in popular literature and in academic research. I think of a book that Tom Mann and his longtime partner, Norm, oh God, how can I not say his name, at AEI, wrote a book several years ago. Thank you. Wrote a book several years ago called It's Worse Than It Looks. And they together track back both on the Republican side and on the Democrat side, although this is a place where there is some false equivalency going on. And they really pinpoint Newt Gingrich's entry into the House of Representatives, that the very first speech that Representative Gingrich made on the House floor, he attacked a member of his own party. In modern politics, that had not happened before. So if you take that as a single behavioral act, and then you fast forward 40 years to where it's very clear now that the majority of the Republican Party is making decisions and using messaging that it cares more about maintaining and gaining power than cares about the common good for the country. And that's not a partisan statement. That can be tracked factually on literally how many decisions you ever want to track it. So what we have to be looking for, and we really need to reinvest at the local level, is starting to bring in a new generation of politicians, elected officials who are working in the system, who are putting the common good back in the central role. That's the point of the democratic society. That is the point of the majority decisions holding the common good. The idea is to work for the aspiration for more inclusion, more justice, making decisions that equal the playing field for all of us. And it is a tragedy. Now, I also want to say something very important. our media environment now, we've got the right-wing stations who we just know they're spewing misinformation constantly. But frankly, even major national channels that are not so partisan, if partisan at all, PBS would be an exception to about what I'm about to say. They are obsessed with covering negative stories. So those of us who've had the privilege of actually working through our organizations with members of Congress, there are a lot of members, the Problem Solving Conference, the Committee on the Modernization of Congress. There are many current members of Congress who do care more about the common good, but their leadership at critical vote points is holding them to a power grab rather than the common good.
I'm not sure if this is exactly in your wheelhouse, but can you talk about the resources to reignite and finance trusted local media sources?
Actually, this is something I have committed to learning a lot more about. And the foundation, the Knight Foundation, that's based in Miami, Florida, that used to be, it was created out of the wealth that was accumulated by the Knight family newspapers in 26 cities across the country. They have held a couple of commissions. I was a senior advisor to an early one, looking deeply at this issue about what can we now do to recreate meaningful local media. So one source that your questioner or others might want to go to is just the Knight Foundation website and read their commission reports. And I'll give you an example of a project I was somewhat involved in. In the city of Akron, there is a lake. One side of the lake, a lot of white wealthy people live. On the other side of the lake, a lot of much lower income African Americans live. And this division meant that the lake wasn't available for recreation opportunities in any possible equality of opportunity. And some local businesses, LeBron James Foundation put funding behind it, and the local newspaper created, and they started with a well-designed survey. What would the community like to happen around this lake? And to make a long story short, over some time, a community commitment got built to creating a hiking, biking path completely encircling the lake. It's a fabulous story. It has created a lot of interaction by the two communities that used to be holding the other as too different to be related to. So local news media played a role in helping that project come to fruition. Another website that you might want to go to is Chalkbeat, which picked the issue of education to create local news media that was neutral and helped the community understand what they wanted for their children for education. Another one is totally on criminal justice. I'm not thinking of the name of it at the moment. The Washington Post, I believe it was 3, although I'm not great on immediate short time frames. The Washington Post dedicated the entire Sunday magazine to an analysis of local media, what killed it, and what is now happening to build it back up. Maybe one of us could find that resource and it could go out when this gets put up on the website. That's the best immediate source that I've seen. But there's very good work going on about this issue. One thing I'd like to say, by the way, people often forget about radio as a source. Actually, more people in America listen to radio for their news than any other source. So that may be an entree at the local level to recreating some news programs that are highly trusted, where the infrastructure already exists. I hope that's helpful.
I believe high voter apathy coupled with the Trump era lack of faith in elections is creating a crisis for our democracy. Are you aware of any programs that focus on civic education for adults outside of citizenship programs and K-12 school-based programs?
Raj Vinakoda created at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And Cheryl, maybe you could look this up while we're talking. I've forgotten the name of it, but it is about civics having to be retaught in the country, not just in schools, but for all of us. Danielle Allen, who was one of the 3 co-chairs of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, which has produced a recommendation with a report with 6 strategies and 31 recommendations, also led an initiative called Educating for Democracy that more than 300 national experts participated in. It's a fabulous, it has its own website, you can look to it. It's a fabulous resource for how to teach civics completely through questioning rather than learning history.
What are your thoughts on changing the filibuster?
Well, actually, I'm glad you've asked that question, because in terms of what one of the earlier questions acknowledged the truth of, the fact that we've spent 18 months now in a sophisticated politician, right-wing media assault on the integrity of our elections, so that voter apathy is an issue. Add to that Republican-dominated legislatures in 38 states. I don't remember the exact number that have passed, but a huge number of state laws that are taking the management of the election process out of the hands of truly nonpartisan election officials and putting them in the hands of the partisan legislature. There are 2 states, I'm not sure of which they are, so I'm not going to say, but where people who participated in the January 6th insurrection are running for the position of Secretary of State. So I personally believe that the issue of the integrity of our votes and the necessity of having this midterm be the largest turnout ever, like 2020 was for the presidency, is dependent upon the Democrats being able to move to a majority vote on the 2 bills in front of Congress on our voting rights. Angus King is an independent senator from Maine who for most of his time in the Senate has been a protector of the filibuster. Google his website and listen to the reasons he has shifted his perspective on why it is now essential to remove the filibuster so that we can pass these 2 voting bill rights. If you look at the history, and I don't have a good source on this, but year by year by year, the filibuster has been used to stop legislation for the common good. And it's been a long time since the filibuster was used to do what it was supposed to do, which was protect the minority voice in a major legislative issue. So the quick answer, what do I think about it? I hope to goodness the Democrats can get it together to remove the filibuster from the 2 voting rights bills. I think the future of American democracy depends on it. And some of your listeners may feel like I've now delved deeply into partisanship. All I can say to you, I'm saying that as an American citizen who's done nothing but work on democracy from a nonpartisan position for more than 30 years.
Thank you for that. What differences do you notice between digital only written conversations, texts and emails versus actually meeting live in person, relating to the expression of political, social views, conflict resolution, and overcoming differences of opinion?
Well, I'm sure every person who's on this webinar has had the experience, particularly around email back and forth or texting back and forth, of things going off track. And in that structured environment of quick back and forths, being nearly impossible to get back on track. I would actually say a simple phone call is a better approach than either texting or emails back and forth on these highly polarized, sensitive political issues. Very clearly, in terms of changing human behavior, in terms of creating empathy, in terms of coming to a place of understanding and even feeling compassionate about someone you had previously been making pretty serious judgments about. The best avenue to do that is face-to-face. The combination of the attack on the integrity of our democratic system, the perpetuation of the big lie, and COVID all happening at the same time has moved a huge amount of our social interaction to exactly what we're doing this evening. Zoom webinars or Zoom calls where you can have interaction. I'm delighted to say that we've all learned how to use this medium much more effectively than I think many of us believed when we started. So look at the website of the Bridge Alliance or the website of Citizen Connect that tells the story of some large scale attempts to get people talking across their divides. One that happened last March and April is called America Talks, that kicked off the National Weekend Conversation in 2021. It will happen again in 2022. Really effective conversations are taking place across differences because it's a safe environment. People are given a structured questionnaire. So it's like they've got their own facilitator sitting with them to actually go through a slow enough process that true listening happens and that a human connection is made. Do I hope we sometime in the not too distant future can come back to doing more of this work face to face? Of course I do. But in the meantime, this is the year in which much of this work needs to be done.
Every day we hear more extraordinary news about what happened both before January 6th and in the aftermath. How do we digest this and how do we move forward from this?
It is pretty extraordinary. I guess it was just last night or the night before when I first heard about the 5 states which actually sent documents that were not legal, but were made to look legal. They sent them to the Congress and to the National Archives, recommending a slate of Trump electors in 5 states that had actually elected Biden. This says that the efforts to overturn the election were well thought out, well planned, and much deeper and widespread than the insurrection was a mob event that was an explosion of manufactured emotion or of, no, the emotion was real, but based on the big lie. I myself, as long as I've been doing this and as disciplined as I am, I myself find sometimes just shaking my head and my God, what can possibly come out next? But I'll tell you the discipline that I use and I think that really matters. How discouraged or encouraged or how empowered or disempowered I feel, how optimistic or pessimistic is completely dependent on what I pay attention to. And if I only pay attention to what's coming out of Congress and national media, it doesn't take me too long to really feel like I'm not sure we can ever get ourselves out of this mess. And that is a real feeling based on real things that are happening. But if I pay attention to what I had the privilege to understand at America Speaks and at NICD, where we worked in communities all over the country, like the website that we talked about at Bridging Divides at princeton.edu, that has a map that shows tens of thousands of organizations that are actually working on this. So if I focus on what we the people are doing to try to combat where we are and to try to reestablish the capacity to live and work together in our communities, then I feel optimistic, and I'm reminded that I, like everybody else, do not have the luxury of falling into the woe is us, what can we do about this? It needs to be having at the ready, who's my best buddy that I talk to when I get discouraged by the latest news, that I get re-energized to link up with those people in my life that are as dedicated as I am to ensuring that our democracy and our democratic institutions are not lost, and I go back to work again the next day.
This is a question about social media and whether it's good, it's bad, it's neither, but how can we stop the fake news promoted through social media?
Well, it's very interesting to watch television and see Facebook now running ads, no longer with Mark Zuckerberg, but with very attractive young people who are dedicated to doing the right thing, talking about how Facebook can't do it without government regulation. Now, I'm just trying to pinpoint one example. I do think worldwide governments have got to step up and create a regulatory framework that actually does put some guardrails on what is allowable on social media in terms of the mass repetition of misinformation. A project that we did at NICD was a documentary called Divided We Fall, which, Cheryl, you should put the link to that up in the, I think people would find that very inspiring, where we brought together people who were Trump lovers and Trump haters. We did this in 2018. And we spent a weekend with them. And we had them first meet one another as human beings. They didn't know who was a Trump hater and who was in fact, they laughed at themselves later for how they stereotyped and were even wrong about who was who on this loving or hating Trump. One of the biggest changes they made in their own lives after going through that experience, where they discovered they liked each other, that groups are still meeting, they have annual reunions. Most of them went back and looked at their own social media feeds and were shocked at how negative, mean was a word that one of them used. And one of the behavioral commitments they made was to stop using so much social media. So I think there's a regulation at the societal level that's necessary on the big ones, and there's a regulation at the self level. How am I using social media? Both in terms of it's predominantly a reactive environment. So can I at least not click the button until I've taken a breath, walked away from my computer, walked back? Is that really what I want to say? Is that what I would want to say if I was talking to this person face to face?
Okay, we're gonna take our last question here. And this one is about our local print media, the newspapers, being far from impartial politically. They bend rather than lean towards, in this case, Republican viewpoints, and try to assert that Washington political actions have no relationship to local politics. How do we clarify that misunderstandings when letters to the editor remain unpublished? What forum should a dissenter employ?
That's a great question. I'm very familiar with that problem in a community that I spend part of the year in Maine, where the paper is owned by a Republican family. The editor is very right of center. And as your questioner just said, won't accept letters to the editor that don't line up with the position they actually want to put forward. Well, what several communities in that part of Maine have done have actually created another print outlet called the Free Press, and have gotten grant support and local support for being a source that is that I started to say is an antidote to. They don't go up against the Republican newspaper on a regular basis, but they spend the time to take the issues that are salient, like how many lobster fishermen licenses are going to be issued this year based on the fact that the Trump trade war with China killed a very major export for Maine lobsters. So it's real political issues, but they have built up enough of a reputation that people know if they want to hear both sides of the issue and want to express their views in a way that is different than the longer term, more established newspaper, they pick up the Free Press. Again, that takes a group of people who are committed to it sufficiently over time to create the resources to make it happen. And then don't start out worrying that it's the most professional thing you've ever seen. Just worry about getting it out there to begin with.
Great. Well, I just wanted to thank Dr. Lukensmeyer for leading this incredibly valuable discussion tonight. You've given us so much to think about and actually a lot to do as well. I also want to thank Cheryl Gravey of the National Institute for Civil Discourse for all her help and for her ongoing partnership with league chapters around the country, and also for all those very helpful chat links. And thanks to all of you for joining us and asking such great questions. Please stay tuned for 2 upcoming Greenwich League events. On February 22nd, we'll be hosting a discussion on whether we should bring ranked choice voting to Connecticut. And in early April, we'll be welcoming back Harvard Business School professor David Moss for an encore community case discussion. And finally, you'll all get an event survey via email tomorrow morning, and we'd be very grateful if you could complete it. We're especially interested in knowing if you'd like us to do more small group democracy and trust building programs here in Greenwich. So I hope you all have a great evening, and we hope this is a start of a terrific year for everyone. Take care. Good night.